Hello, Word of Christ, and welcome. I want to welcome you to your group. We are at week 15, and it's exciting to be with you. First of all, I want to say God bless you to you, your group, your family. We are thrilled to be with you this week as we continue on, as we go deeper, as we go further, and as our hearts become more alive to the message of God's master plan in us. And so this week, Masoud is with us as we continue to look at this, and I'm excited. And we're going to do something a little bit different this week. I'm going to fill you in just a second on what that's going to be like. Before we talk about this week's message, I'm going to ask something of you. We need your support. We need your help in this regard. And so we are available and online at several locations on the internet. And I'd like to ask you to please follow us and support us on these sites. I'm sure you are on most of them, if not all of them. And so first of all, on our Facebook page, you can find us if you search for Word of Christ Community. That's our predominant place. And the first thing I want you to know is that is a community for us. For those of you that journey with us, it's an interactive community. We would love for you to ask and request to join that. It's a private community. It's not available to the public. And we'd love for you to share your thoughts on the message, on the teaching of the week. Tell us what's going on in your heart. If the Lord is showing you something or revealing something to you, we want to hear about it, and we want our community to be blessed by it. So that's a place for you to participate and be part of our community. That's Word of Christ Community on Facebook. If you search for that, you'll find our orange logo, and you can click on that. Ask to join that. We'll respond as quickly as we can, and you'll be able to join us in the community, join the conversation, and be part of Word of Christ in that regard and in that space. The other place many of us find our videos on YouTube, and so that's available. That place you can find us a little bit differently. If you go to YouTube and you search for WOCIC, that's WOCIC, that's the best and easiest and fastest way to find us. Again, you'll see our orange logo. You can click on our channel. I'm going to ask you, please subscribe to that channel. And when you watch the video, if that's where you watch the video, I'm going to ask you to like the video on that site. And help us join and build some momentum in our cyber community as we reach out. And then the last two places are slightly more casual, but you should follow us as well. We are always posting words of encouragement, pictures of our groups, and we want you to follow us on both Instagram and Twitter. And our handle on both of those are exactly the same. You can find us at My Word of Christ. If you search for My Word of Christ on both Instagram and on Twitter, you'll find us on both of those channels as well. So please, if you're on your phone, you can do that right now as you're sitting in your group. Before we jump into the message, look for us in those locations. Make sure that you're following, tracking with us. Hit the notification button so you get notified if we make a post, and you'll be connected with us in the most direct way possible. So thank you for joining us. And of course, you could always follow us on our website at WOCIC.com as well. You can follow us and look into our groups and the community there as well. God bless you, family. Now, as we get ready for week 15 with Masoud, we're going to do something a little bit differently this week. Instead of us providing you some recap points, I'm going to ask you guys to recap within your group. And so we will not providing recap points this week. I think this week in particular lends itself to great discussion as we look at the time in the wilderness that Egypt had in the wilderness, and Masoud takes us through that, and strength in the wilderness, in a time of wilderness. And there couldn't be a more relevant topic for us to discuss within our groups. And so we're not going to give you the bullet points this week. We're going to have you take some notes during the message, take some notes online, have your phone out, have a pen and paper, however you wish to do that. Take some notes and be ready to share what's on your heart and what you heard during that message at the end of the message. All right, let's get to it. Thank you, family, and we'll see you on the other side.
Hey everyone, this is Masoud again, and I'm here with you with another lesson from God's master plan. I trust that you've been growing over the past several weeks in the understanding of your story of redemption as it's being portrayed in the Old Testament scriptures. And we have started basically the last part or the last section of this series, which is the story of Israel. And today I want to talk to you about the part that is called wilderness. We had an intro, and then Rose talked to you about Egypt, which is mostly about the story of flesh and being slave to sin in flesh. But now, what about the story of wilderness, and what happens, or what was the story of wilderness, and what is the place of basically wilderness in our lives? So before actually moving on, I need to draw the same picture that we've actually drawn over and over, but it's good to do it because we have to see things again in this context. So if I go actually to very beginning of the story of Israel, we have basically a journey that starts from Egypt. So I'm going to actually divide this into 3 sections. So the first part was Egypt, which is where they were actually slaves. And then they come out, they come to a place called wilderness, and they are here for 40 years, and then they get into a place that is called the promised land or the promised land. I mean, both can be used. And all of this story starts because there was something before this, which is the story of Abraham. And the story of Abraham is the story of basically God's promise to his seed. And of course, we've covered all of this in details, but I wanted you to see again this part once again. So when we read through some of the scriptures, actually you see details and which part of this story we are talking about. So God came to Abraham and he said to him that actually I will take you to a land. So I'm going to actually put this here. So this was the promise. Abraham, I will come out of your land and I will take you to another land. And later we found out that actually that was called this promised land. So this was the journey. But then we know that from Abraham, a nation came out, the nation of Israel, who actually was in bondage in Egypt for basically almost 400 years. And then God brought Moses, and Moses actually brought them out of Egypt through many signs, wonders, and miracles, and they got into wilderness. Now, if Egypt was actually flesh and their slavery was slavery to, let's say, sin, what is the portion in wilderness? What is the highlight? Because we can actually go into so many different directions. We can spend time on Egypt and spend more on that and explain every details of that. But we don't want to do that because there are going to be other series and there are going to be basically other topics that we're going to cover. But what about the next stage, wilderness? This is where actually we're going to look at Deuteronomy and look at what Moses, the one who brought them out of Egypt, is telling them in wilderness. And this is not actually the beginning of the story of wilderness. This is 40 years later. So Moses is actually, if you consider this actually also time-wise, this is where they are about to enter the promised land. And this is what actually Moses begins to tell them. Look at verse 2 of chapter 8, book of Deuteronomy. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you. Okay, I'm going to put it actually here, every word that we read. So to humble you. Okay, to humble you. And to test you. Okay, I'm going to put this here. To test you. To know what was in your heart. Okay, to know what was in the heart, whether you would keep his commandment or not. Okay, so therefore there is something called the commandment. Okay, verse 3. So he humbled you and allowed you to hunger. Okay, all of this. Now it says allowed you to hunger. Okay, and then fed you with manna. Okay, that is important. Fed you again with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Okay, all of this, I'm going to actually now put this here, says that man does not live by bread alone, but actually by the word that comes from the mouth of God. Okay, all of this was that they may know this. Okay, this is important. That eventually they would come to realize that life is coming, it comes from the words that God speaks, not from external events, circumstances, food, blessings, cursings, anything, but that life comes from the words that you hear from God. Okay, this is very important. This is super important because this is everything about the story of wilderness. Now, let me actually tell you what this is all about. Later we come actually to, I'm just going to fast forward to New Testament and the book of Hebrews, because I can take you to Deuteronomy and Numbers and Exodus and show you that actually the time of wilderness was the time of testing, the time of temptation. It was the time of, it was known by the serpents, it was known by actually how they tested God, they tempted God, they constantly spoke the words that would start by if, but I rather actually take you to the New Testament and plainly read what is the interpretation of those things. Look at chapter 3, verse 7, that says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, you can put word instead of voice. Today if you hear his word, do not harden your hearts. Okay, now let's look at the picture to know what was in your heart. So what was supposed to be in their heart was the commandment of the Lord, which is the word of the Lord, not in the sense of actually keeping the commandment. There was no commandment given when actually they were going through these things. The story of manna and all of that is, I think, Exodus chapter 16, 17, and the law was given in chapter 20. So they did not have a commandment yet, but they had a word. Now, what was the word that they had? Well, the word that Moses gave them in Egypt. What was that? The word that God himself gave to Moses. And what was that? It is that I have heard the groaning of these people, and I have come to deliver them from the ones whom they are a slave of. And this is according to my word to my servant Abraham, which was the promise that was given to him. So what was the command that was to be in their heart? It was the promise of God. Okay, so he says, today if you hear his word, do not harden your hearts. That means allow this word to dwell in your heart. But it says, as you did in rebellion in the days of trial, which is the word temptation, in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me or tempted me and tried me and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was, okay, let me just put it this way. Why this is written and why we read this? Because obviously there is a history, and I'm going to tell you the background history of why actually he says, in the day of trial in wilderness where your fathers tested me and tried me and saw my works 40 years. They came out of Egypt so that they could get into the promised land, not into wilderness. The wilderness was the way between Egypt and the promised land. Now, he says, they tried me, they tempted me. Now, if you go and read these stories, it's always like this. Is this God able to give us water in this wilderness? Then, is this God able to give us bread in this wilderness? Then, is this God able to give us meat to eat in this wilderness? It was constantly actually forgetting God's ability and faithfulness to do what he had said. And because of this, instead of moving forward with the word of the Lord to inherit what he had promised to them, they were always questioning his will and his ability to do so. And the reason for that was their external circumstances. So they had heard a word in Egypt, which is, come out, I will take you to the land that I had promised you. And they came out, and so quickly, actually, they began to return to Egypt in their hearts, because the word of the Lord did not have a place in their heart. They did not believe the promise. They did not believe the promise. So they lived as still slaves, although they were made free. Now, God made them free because he wanted to bring them actually to a land that was, they were not anymore slaves. Let me actually put this here. So here in Egypt, they were slave. Here in Promised Land, they were supposed to be the heirs. There is a big difference between being a slave, which is you don't have anything, you belong to somebody else, and you work for them, you serve them, and you have no will of your own, you have no possession of your own, to become an heir who actually is an heir, possesses something, and lives in a place, he's free, and all of that. Now, it says, from slavery to being an heir, there is a stage called wilderness. And wilderness is a place, I talked about this briefly, I think, in the first session of the story of Israel, but I'm going to tell you this again, because I need to actually, I want all of us to focus on this. This is super important. Okay, let me put this in this way. Somebody who is sick, okay, and let's say, okay, I'm just going to continue with this example. Somebody who is sick and is weak and can't do anything. When the sickness is gone, the person is not yet able to actually go and do hard work, because there is a recovery period. Okay, and that is when he's gaining or she's gaining strength. So there is a distance between being sick and being someone that is working full strength, and that is the recovery time. Now, these three stages, Egypt, wilderness, and promised land, this is a story that there is a wilderness between Egypt, which is slavery, and promised land, which is heirship. And this is the story, that Egypt looks like somebody who is, or a place that somebody is sick and is weak and has no strength. Wilderness is where you begin to recover, okay? And then you enter into the promised land. Why manna is so big in the story of wilderness? Because bread, manna, which was the bread is what actually physically strengthens you. I mean, I understand that today we have so many other food, but bread has always been the food for mankind. What actually gives the strength. That's why Jesus calls himself the bread of life. It's known, there is nothing like bread that can actually give you strength. So story of wilderness was actually where I'm going to let me just go to another page. So let me just put this again, these 3 stages. And we already know this is Egypt, this is wilderness, and this is promised land. Okay, so here Egypt is where actually there was weakness. This is the place that you begin to actually gain strength. Okay, you are being strengthened. Okay, this is important, because the land that God has promised, it was a land, we've covered this before, but it had enemies. And a weak person cannot go and possess the land that occupies enemies, but someone that, so this is not possible, but a person that has gained strength can. Okay, so wilderness was a place that actually strength was supposed to be supplied. It was supposed to be a place that they had strength. And in the language of the New Testament, now I'm going to put this in the language of the New Testament, because eventually we don't care about the old. We want to understand, okay, how does that apply to me? Here you have a weak. Okay, here you had a weak conscience. Okay, this is where actually you were a slave to sin, and you had no understanding of your sonship. You had no understanding of being son of God. You had no understanding of being the heir of God. You had no understanding of being one with God. No understanding. So it was a conscience that was so weak. It was always seeing himself or herself in flesh. The image that we had taken upon ourselves was actually the image of flesh. We believe that we are actually slaves to flesh. And this is where you begin to actually experience sonship now, the promised land. Okay, but in order for this to happen, you have to have this stage of strengthening. Okay, so here you begin to be strengthened in word, in conscience. Conscience, which is of the heart, by the way. Okay, so now let's quickly look at chapter 13 of the book of Hebrews and see what the New Testament says about this. Verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Sounds like Egypt, wilderness, and promised land. Egypt being yesterday, wilderness being today, and promised land being forever. Now, forever doesn't mean after death. This is a spiritual journey, not a time dependent story. Okay, it's a maturity that happens out of slavery of Egypt into a strength that we are gaining strength to believe what God has said about us, so that you can actually, in story of promised land, you begin to experience the fullness of this sonship. And by the way, this doesn't have to be like fully come out of here to be here. This is the story that you can be in wilderness today and the next moment you can be in promised land, because these are spiritual realities. But you don't want to be back and forth. We want to be always in the promised land and just remain there and be there and experience that, and all the good things that come with that. So But I brought you here to show you what is this story. So Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Let me just explain this a bit. Your situation in life changes. Okay, circumstances changes, time changes, your age changes, your job changes, your financial situation changes, your relationship with others actually change, and you're going through changes and changes and changes and changes and changes. But when the things that change become your focus, you change too, which means you're as good as your circumstances. Now, the story is this, that Jesus Christ doesn't change, the truth doesn't change, what is revealed about you in him doesn't change, so why should we change? So that means it's the same God who was in Egypt, who was with them in wilderness, who was going to actually go before them into the promised land. It's the same Jesus that was crucified as the Lamb of God. It's the same Jesus that is actually as high priest working in us in wilderness. It's the same Jesus that will be the glory revealed in us in the promised land. So it's the same one. And if we look unto him and not the circumstances of life, guess what happens? You go from strength to strength. And that's what we read in verse 9. Do not be carried about with various and strange doctrines, which is the word teaching. I mean, simply the word doctrines means teachings. So do not be carried about with various and strange doctrines, for it is good for the heart to be established by grace, not with foods which have not profited those who have been occupied with them. Let me explain. It says there people actually eat food and their body receives food, and through that you receive strength. He says now you can be also established in your heart by grace. If you put them side by side, compare the two, see the parallel that is actually given to us by the Holy Spirit, is this, that just as there is a food for the body, there is a food for the heart. The food for the body is the bread. The food for the heart is grace. And grace strengthens you. Grace establishes you. So this is the place, wilderness is the place that you are actually growing in grace. Okay, so anytime a bread is given to you, anytime a revelation is given to you in your heart, is the grace of God that is actually revealing more of who you are. And in wilderness, you're growing in stature. You're moving from the river Egypt all the way to river Jordan. And this is the story of coming out from basically slavery mindset, slave conscious, weak conscience, always seeing ourselves like the sinners, saved by grace, always seeing ourselves as like, we are not perfect. Who do you think you are? Or nobody is perfect. Nobody can be perfect. We have to die. And then all that story is a weak conscience. And because of that, obviously, there is condemnation, there is accusations, there is thoughts of I'm not able, I can't, God doesn't want to. And he says, that is basically the beginning of the story of wilderness. But as you go through that, God is bringing out what is in your heart. He said, actually, let me take you back to the previous slide. Okay, so he said in wilderness, he humbled you to test you, to know what was in your heart. It wasn't the word of the Lord in your heart, what he has said, but it was actually what you believed still from Egypt that was in your heart. That's why it says they returned to Egypt in their heart. Okay, they didn't physically return. In their heart, they returned to Egypt. That means the same heart that was in them in Egypt was working in them in wilderness. Although outside there was no enemy anymore. There was no Pharaoh anymore. But in Egypt, they lived with the same heart. They lived in the same slavery. They lived in the same weak conscience, and they did not see. And that's why, by the way, that they made an image and they called that their God in wilderness. And guess where they had seen that image? In Egypt. So they were walking in wilderness with the same God of Egypt. And guess what we see anytime that anything mentioned about God in the Old Testament? An image. So, and guess who takes the image upon themselves? Man. So they in wilderness were walking by a God that was actually the God of Egypt and not the Lord Yahweh. Okay, so that is actually speaking to us right now, that although we have come out of slavery, but still at times in the heart we think of God as, the image that we had taken upon ourselves in flesh, and that's how we see him. But he says God in wilderness is taking this out of you, this false image that you have seen of God, and that's why you actually have taken that upon yourself, and you live by that false image, and that's why you see yourself a slave. But he actually is causing you to eat this food. And now I'm going to actually go to the book of Matthew to show you what this word is in plain language. Let's look at Matthew chapter 3 in verse 4. It says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." Then Jesus was led up. Then. What does that then mean? It means something happened that after that, this happened. Okay, what happened before that? Let's see what happened. Verse 17, "And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.' Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness." Okay, this is the story. The Father says, "This is my Son, Jesus." And then the Spirit takes him or leads him, leads him up, led him up into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Look at what happens later. "And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward he was hungry." Okay, sounds like the story of Israel in wilderness. And we know that they were in wilderness 40 years and Jesus was in the same wilderness for 40 days. So it's not about time, it's about what happens. Like, what are you doing in these times? So he's hungry. Now, let me actually say something. Obviously, there are more into this, but let me just interpret this in a different light. He just heard, "This is my Son." There is 40 days of hunger. Okay, now let me show you what is the food first. In verse 3 says, "Now when the tempter came to him, said, 'If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread.'" Okay, let's stop. He heard the word of God, and then the devil came and questioned the same thing. It says Jesus actually experienced hunger for 40 years, for 40 days. And the tempter comes and says, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." I'm going to actually tell you what the hunger was. But before that, verse 4, "But he answered and said, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.'" Okay. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by the word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He compares the word that comes from the mouth of the Lord to bread. And there was something that he had heard as the word that came from the mouth of God, which was, "This was my Son." So this is my Son, the word of the Lord, is the bread that he heard and he ate. He hungered for 40 years. That sounds like not hearing the same thing again. Don't you agree? That he just heard that you are my son. 40 days later, he says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by the word that comes from the mouth of God. And that is what he heard 40 days ago. And there is a period of 40 days that sounds like nothing. No word from the Lord. This is the thing. This is the point. You don't need another word from the Lord when things around you change. You don't need it. You already heard it. When Jesus heard, this is my son, and when he didn't hear anything and the situation around him was changing, he still was living by the bread that was given to him. This is my son. Established once for all. Any temptation that came after that, which was in the form of if you are the son, had no place in him. Guess what? He was in wilderness 40 days, the same wilderness, no bread, and filled with serpents, which is temptation, and he didn't give in to that. Isn't it amazing? So he didn't actually give in to believing a false, he didn't come into doubt. He didn't say, okay, I heard that I'm the son, but it doesn't look like I'm the son. Well, because there is a weakness that is turning into strength. There was a time of slavery in flesh in Egypt, and now there is a time of gaining strength in wilderness. There is a word that you hear, and then that gives you strength, and then you move on, you hear another word, and there is a strength, and you move on, there is another word you hear, and strength. And then little by little, everything that is in your heart comes out. The word of grace, this is my son, with whom I am well pleased, actually changes you. And then you realize that, okay, when God said, I am well pleased with you already, and that is the food, that is the bread for me, I'm not going to take the stone and turn them to bread. The interpretation being, I'm not going to perform so I can prove that what I had heard is the truth. I'm not going to live based on actually keeping a set of rules to be a son. I hope this is clear, okay? Because the stone in the context, it actually shows, one could be actually performing the law. So you do something according to the law to actually qualify yourself, but it's also the dictates of one's heart to do what he thinks he has to do to actually please God. Jesus says, okay, let me tell you, what you're telling me that I have to turn the stone into bread to please God, well, I already heard he's already pleased with me. So no need for that. And you say, if you're the Son of God, I have already heard I am the Son of God. No need for that. So he actually lived by the word that had proceeded from the mouth of God. Well, obviously there is more, but if you don't hear something, if you don't have a word from the Lord, if you don't have a clear direction, if you don't have, one of those amazing experiences or feelings, nothing has changed. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. His word has not changed. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the Son of God which was preached among you by us is not yes or no, or yes and no. It's always yes and amen to the glory of God spoken through us. So, and he says he has even given us the Holy Spirit as a guarantee. Guarantee for what? For your inheritance. Which means the Spirit in our heart bears witness with us that we are sons. If we are sons, we're not going to live like slaves. We are heirs, heirs with Christ, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. So if we suffer with him, that we shall be glorified with him. So if there is something that doesn't seem to be, according to the word that you have heard, the word hasn't changed. The circumstances has changed. So please don't let anything around you change your heart and your conscience to a slave mentality where you don't anymore believe what God says about you. Okay, obviously there is more about this. I can't cover everything 30 minutes. Well, actually, it's been more than 30 minutes. But anyways, so let me just say this. You came out of slavery of flesh and sin, and you've been in the time of temptation where actually things doesn't feel like the same that they were supposed to be. Well, that's the time that you can gain strength. You can allow your heart to exercise the word of the Lord. Let that become the foundation of your heart, the belief in your heart, and become the confession in your mouth, because then you won't be bitten by serpents. You won't be actually experiencing death by your own tongue, but you will come to a place that you will cross over and you will experience the promise. Okay, because the Hebrews 4 tells us the word that they heard in wilderness, they did not mix it with faith. What was the word? Well, there was a promise given to them that I will take you to a land. So I hope this helps you guys. But you can read Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4. There is so much in the New Testament about temptation, about really confession of faith, believing, stepping into what God has called you to be, seeing yourself as He says you are, and all of that, and that becomes the food for your heart. Blessings to you, and we'll see you in the next week.
Okay, Word of Christ, another tremendous teaching. Thank you, Masoud, for sharing us and bringing such revelation to us. There you have it, church. I'm not going to give you any hints. This week, it's up to you to open your heart and share. And I believe God will speak through you. He'll speak and share between your group, and it'll be a time that you get to share some life-giving points. We'll come back and recap this, and we'll have some recaps available on our website for this, but I don't want to give them to you yet. I want you to discuss them within your group, really generate a conversation about this. And as a reminder, please follow us on our channels as well. The links to all of those locations are available within our description. They're not only on the screen, but they'll be available in our description. We look forward to you joining us in our community, be part of our Word of Christ community. We love you, family. God bless you. We're praying for you. We're believing God for you. And we'll see you next week on week 16. God bless you.